So essentially, we know that the advent of technology advancements in omics research has shifted the paradigm of modern medicine, and 21st century technology gives us the means to enable precise healthcare and a patient-centric approach. And as Africa, we know that we need to move forward in order to address our disease burden sustainably. And obviously, the one-size-fits-all store does not work anymore. So it leads me on to this definition of personalized medicine. And essentially, it is a medical model categorizing in individuals' phenotypes and genotypes with molecular profiling, medical imaging, lifestyle data, and tailoring the right therapeutic strategy for the right person at the right time. And essentially, it's a meal of technologies. It's a combination of biological, physical, engineering, computer, and health sciences to set the stage for transformation and a leap towards a targeted, data-driven healthcare mechanism for patients. And, it's amazing that since the first human genome was sequenced in the year 2000, Africa has not been studied. I should say understudied. Essentially, if you look at the ancestral lineage and you see Africans, we have maintained a large and subdivided population structure. And if you look at this linkage disequilibrium diagram here, you essentially, I just want to very quickly say that we've been spending a lot of time over the years, from the year 2000 onward, essentially studying the arm on the right, which is the non-African populations. And we have left out this whole ancestral origin, and there's this large diversity that needs to be unpacked. And if you look at Africa, and if you think of it, it's basically a map of African language family distributions and its hypothesized migration events within and out of Africa. And you can see how the continent is kind of divided in almost regional areas. So, we formulated the European African Personalized Medicine Consortium in round about 2021, and we are a consortium of 13 partners from both Europe and Africa, and there's all of the organizations involved. Essentially, it's France, Italy, our fellow Africans in Egypt, Kenya, and Senegal, and ourselves here in South Africa, as well as the AU NEPAD. And essentially, the project is set to develop collaboration between Africa and Europe in the field of personalized medicine, and to be able to contribute a successful implementation of personalized medicine in a global context. And the outcomes that emanate from this, initiative will foster joint personalized medicine projects and programs between Europe and Africa, as well as the more developed Western countries. And the project commenced in February. And one of the first activities of our project was to basically gain knowledge on the African research and innovation and policy landscape in Africa. And we developed a bibliometric analysis of recent scientific literature to describe the scientific landscape of personalized medicine in Africa, which includes a large focus on genomics, proteomics science, data science, and health systems. And we reviewed this health research and innovation policy landscape in the continent. And this study was designed in a descriptive scanning model. We scoped databases, and we used essentially primarily PubMed. And so this bibliometric analysis basically looked at all aspects, from research groups to research areas and disease categories, and the type of research collaborations with European countries. And what we essentially found was that, we gathered information from 2011 to 2020, and we found that there's a real spike in activity in roundabout from 2017 onward to about 2020. And we found that there were 3,205 institutions involved in this area of research, about 4,340 publications, 70% were international collaboration, 60% were first author from Africa, 63% open access, and about 109 collaborating countries, 36% in top journals, and in the top 10% journals, and about 39,204 researchers involved in this area. And if we map this scientific productivity in Africa and the global view of co-authored publications, we found that main collaborators existed in Europe, the USA, as well as Australia. And then we have some collaborations sort of spread out across the globe. And if you look at publications per African country, when we map this, we find that South Africa and Egypt lead by a very, very far margin compared to the rest of the continent. And then with regard to Africa and Europe co-authored publications, we find that there's a higher number of publications with UK, France, and Germany. So you can see the graph that I just put up. It basically shows the expansion of research activity in this area over the time period. And if you look at disease categories and research areas, almost 82% of all articles were found to be related to one of the 13 disease entities here shown. And, the interest was mainly in infectious diseases, followed by cancer, immune system, and nervous system diseases were more pronounced than other diseases. And the increase of articles in 2020 compared to 2011 was remarkable, and it was more evident in bacterial infection related publications, which were 14 times higher, followed by cardiovascular and virus diseases. And if you look at the research themes, yes, of course, institutions in South Africa and Egypt obviously lead. And when you look at the different areas of research, that is diagnosis, prevention, and treatment, we found that South African institutions, the top 5 institutions were South African. And with respect to European collaboration, as I mentioned in the graph, we found that the top collaborative countries were the UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, and Italy in each of the diagnosis and treatments areas, while prevention followed the same pattern observed, except you would see that Spain was higher than Italy. And sorry, the slide hasn't changed. So the review of the health and research and innovation policy landscape in Africa was then our second objective, where we looked at policy across. And the objective of this review was to obviously identify policies that support and promote health research and innovation, and if there's any specific programs or initiatives that support personalized medicine. As such, research programs, training, infrastructure, innovation, industry, and the results basically provide an overview of the capacities and situation of African countries in this space, with a special focus on personalized medicine. And at the same time, it helps us identify relevant stakeholders. And so we broke it down in terms of a framework where we looked at governance, financing of health research, resources, health research outputs, international collaboration, and then actual personalized medicine and genomics research outputs. And if you look at this framework, we used indicators obviously in each of the areas, for example, in governance, the NHRS barometer, the existence of laws and regulations, financing, we looked at GERD as percentage GDP, and GERD, medical and health sciences percentage, and then international funding, resources in terms of infrastructure and researchers per million inhabitants, publications per million inhabitants, number of projects funded, and then participating in genomics research, sort of what is the level of participation in international consortia, and the number of publications and the number of institutions involved and organizations. And essentially, we scored this on a matrix, and I'm almost finished. We scored this on a matrix, and you can see this view graphically, where we show how the different countries vary in terms of their capacity for research and innovation according to the policies that exist there. And still, South Africa and Egypt lead, followed by Nigeria, Algeria, Kenya, and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. And essentially, the results from this mapping, I mean, if you want to have a more elaborate understanding of it, I would urge you to visit our website where you can download. It's a very, very long document for you to look at. And the results were basically validated through a robust stakeholder engagement. We have accumulated a database of over 500 key stakeholders across the African continent. These are representatives of government, academia, industry, and civil society. And this work is essentially building that narrative that is required for African research and innovation toward personalized medicine. And this is a realistic context that can be used and shared by all. And we have developed policy briefs and other things like, to stimulate the higher level discussions and the higher level dialogues. And we urge you, if you want, to join us in our future activities. And, we're essentially trying to create a community or network. And we have embarked on regional approaches and are completing analysis in each of the regions within Africa. We're uncovering gaps, needs, and areas of mutual interest as we host an array of regional workshops. And we aim to foster, cross-border collaboration and identify future actions, translation of science to policy, and enhancing the dialogue between African countries and the more developed West, especially in Europe in terms of collaboration with the International Consortium for Personalized Medicine and EuroPermed, which are the European Commission programs that are running. And, we have commenced on also a set of training activities, and we welcome that closer collaboration from anyone who is interested in this agenda and shares the same passion. And we're having a African-wide meeting in February next year alongside the International Congress for Human Genetics in Cape Town. So contact me if you feel free to do that. And I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Rizwana. I have a few questions for you, and I'd like you to pack them. But I just want to make some comments or just observations. One of the things that you raised was around the collaboration, international collaboration. And part of the reason why I said this is a family meeting, a family reunion, is that in a previous webinar, Veronica Miller raised the issue that when the collaborations happen and they are across the continent, the first authors tend to come from the global north. And what that tells you that the agenda is not really an African agenda. So that you can park for now. Because if you talk about personalized medicine and pharmacogenomics, and that's directed at the African continent, African genomes, the agenda has to be directed by the Africans for their own benefit. The second question that I will ask, maybe before I hand over to Dr. Pediako Yao, is the issue of the distribution of cancers. Just to highlight the issue of who controls the agenda. At the launch of the Pan-African Cancer Research Institute, I don't know if Professor Zola-Rumin is here, there was a presentation of the global distributions of cancer, which was a frightening presentation if you realize what the implications were, that we in this part of the world are working on cancers that are not really prevalent in our environment, because we are being driven by an agenda, whether the agenda is around funding or whether it's around equipment or whether it's around collaborations that talks to the global north. And he showed in the presentation, Professor Bates it was, that there's almost a dislinkage between the distribution patterns in the north and in the south. So I think I just want to park that before I hand over to Yao. I don't know if he's joined us. Dr. Pediako is joining us from Ghana and from Yamachi Biotech. Welcome back to the family, Yao.
Thank you, Dr. Msumi. It's good to be back. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. I presume you want me to walk through my presentation now?
Yes, please.
I think I don't have screen share. I think you need to make me a host. life science research company based in Accra, focused on diversifying precision oncology. So I think we started operations just 2 months after the EU Africa Personalized Medicine Consortium started. So I'm hoping that we can find a way to join in the efforts. But actually, I saw APHRC was a partner, and one of our partners in Africa is actually APHRC. So it'd be interesting to hear more about that following this meeting. This point has already been made, but it bears repeating that the African continent is really home to the world's most genetically diverse population. But unfortunately, the African population is also probably the least studied. And so this compounds the issues related with, really a lack of understanding of various diseases, including cancer, which is the particular focus of my company, across Africa. But given the position that African populations, occupy in global evolutionary history, this is actually not just unfortunate for people of African descent, but really it presents a gap that it has global significance. And so I think it's important to make the point that by studying genomes across Africa, this is not just an issue of equity, an issue of representation, but it's really a scientific issue in that we are ignoring a significant chunk of our genetic history as a human race. And by studying genomes in Africa, we actually have the opportunity to unlock a variety of solutions to disease, not just in people of African descent, but in people of all ethnicities. So the problem that exists is one that is obviously one where majority of publicly available genomic data is of people of European or Caucasian ancestry, as you can see from the pie charts on the left. Almost 80% of genomes that have been sequenced are from people of European origin. Only less than 3% are from people of African descent. But in fact, if you look at the pie chart, you can see that other ethnicities, Asian, Latin American, or Hispanic, are all very, very poorly represented. Less than 2% of clinical trial participants are people of African descent. So, once again, the African continent is largely ignored. And this is resulting in a situation where precision medicine is actually not very precise if you're not Caucasian. So majority of, there's growing evidence in the US, for instance, that certain precision tools are least effective in African Americans. And this is largely because they were not included in the training sets. So precision tools depend on data to train their models. And if your population is not included in these models, then you have a problem where the algorithms or the markers that are derived from these research may not be very representative and so may not be as effective. And so there's a clear need across pharma to diversify and in so doing, hopefully produce products, produce tools that are effective regardless of a patient's ethnicity. So the scientific literature is beginning to be flooded by papers and describing this issue. There's actually a whole sort of issue of Nature Outlook that's focusing on precision medicine and really talking about the lack of diversity. So these are just a few examples of recent literature that is describing this issue. The idea that we are leaving behind certain people, and actually precision medicine potentially, if not checked, will exacerbate disparity. Precision medicine is meant to improve the quality of healthcare, but by basing it purely on certain populations, it actually potentially will exacerbate existing problems. So, the final sort of question is, why do we need to develop health solutions aligned to Africa's genomic diversity? For some of us, this is probably obvious, but to others, it may not be. First of all, it allows us to improve diagnosis. So we have a growing burden of non-communicable disease on the African continent. Many NCDs have genetic origins, including cancer. And so as we look to try to provide better healthcare, as we transition from infectious diseases to non-infectious or non-communicable diseases, we need to better understand host genomics. We need to better understand the genetics of people. And across Africa, it's not one size fits all. Africa is the most genetically diverse. So simply doing research in West Africa is not good enough. You need Pan-African initiatives to really understand the basis of disease across the vast diversity that exists on the African continent. This would help us to improve efficacy of existing treatments and existing diagnostic tools. You can think in terms of current panels, perhaps that are used in cancer diagnosis. Maybe some of the markers in these panels could be better optimized. Maybe there are other markers that could be included to diversify or to enhance the ability of these panels to actually diagnose people. Cystic fibrosis is a good example where certain markers typically found in Europeans are not found in African populations, and this leads to a significant underdiagnosis of cystic fibrosis among Africans. We need to reduce toxicity. Pharmacogenetics, pharmacokinetics vary significantly across different ethnic groups. And there are severe problems that can arise when you use dosing strategies that are developed in one part of the world and try to just use them without optimization in other parts. So we need to better understand how drugs are metabolized and potentially improve the outcomes that we get from existing drugs. So it may lengthen the life of existing drugs by just better targeting them to specific populations or adjusting dosages based on individuals' ability to metabolize these drugs. And then finally, what is most exciting perhaps for some of us in life science research is the potential to discover new treatments. And this is not just an issue for African people, as I said. We need new treatments globally. And diseases like cancer continue to kill large numbers of people no matter where you live. And there's a need for better ways to treat cancers. I believe strongly that tapping into the African genome, tapping into the African diversity potentially will provide keys to unlock new treatments for cancer that will be benefit for people beyond the continent, not just in Africa, but all over the world. So I believe Africa's, genomic diversity, where at least 10% of DNA, so the 10% of our genome remains to be discovered, because the current reference genome is not very diverse, not very representative. So I think that potentially gives us the opportunity to make new discoveries and really redefine or improve the healthcare across Africa. So with that, I'll end. I'm happy to take questions during the panel discussion, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Yao. I noticed during your presentation a lot of folks furiously writing down questions, and I'm not going to keep them waiting. I'm going to move directly to Yusuf Enriquez from Indigenous. No, can you connect Yusuf? Yusuf. Okay, I'm told Louise Zabini wants to speak now. It's demanding to speak now because he's getting on a plane. So we are going to oblige him. And I don't know how we're going to ask him questions when he's on the plane. But we'll try. Louise, over to you. Please introduce yourself and the area of your work.
Sorry to bother you, is because otherwise I have to board and I'm not going to be able. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I just need to share screen, please. And sorry for being a troublemaker. Is just otherwise it's going to be quite tight. But I'll like to.
Troublemaking is your second name. We know that, Louise. Don't worry. You will be forgiven.
And I would like to thank the BioAfrica Convention for inviting me to be part of this panel. And also I would like to thank you all to come before me, because I don't need to talk too much, because he covered most of my talk. I hope you can see my screen. Hello?
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, my lab at the ICGB in Cape Town is about cancer genomics, and I think was really nice coming after you all because everything that he says, I just want to complement for more information. And basically, the whole concept a long time ago, which was initially individualized medicine and then become precision medicine, was to go away from the commonality of the disease and it goes to the diversity of the disease when you compare the health group with individuals. And initially, and even nowadays, we have a lot of successfuls. The first ones is the case of Arisa, that when you have a specific mutant, the drug is going to work, or if you don't have that mutant, the drug is not going to work. And this was followed by many other research that in leukemia or in lung cancer or in skin cancer, that was based on certain mutations or genes that one treatment were effective. And then they path to precision quality. The only thing here is all these studies, as you all mentioned before, everything was based in populations in US and Europe, and it was not taking consideration the diversity or the population in Africa, which makes not really these treatments, let's put this way, appropriate for certain populations in our continent. And he says in our continent also is really diverse, then it may not even these treatments be really targeting any of the patients here. Then in the beginning, they thought that this could be addressed just so through clinical trials, but the point that was making before is there is a genetic makeup playing a role here. And this is important. If we don't know this genetic makeup, we're not going to go to get a specific and right therapy for these patients. Then what I would like just to show you is some of the efforts that my group in ICGB is doing in the continent in various types of cancer. The first one, which is a prostate cancer, which is one of the main cancers affecting the African men here, which is a consortium with 3 countries, Nigeria, Sudan, and South Africa. And we are following them up in terms of treatment response and genomics. And by doing this, we were able to find complete different genes that are being responsible for the development of the disease in these patients. And not just this, but also some markers that can be obtained through liquid biopsies. Here is just an example of electron microscope pictures of exosomes where circulating vesicles that it can contain, for example, genetic material, and you can improve diagnosis in this population. A second cohort that we've been doing is in the hepatocellular carcinoma, which is also the high importance in the continent. And you can see it's involved 4 countries, South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And account for 90% of liver malignancies here. Then this type of consortium are helping us not just to shape the cancer development in the continent, but also to increase the precision medicine for this kind of patients. And the last one is the Wills tumor, which is a rare kidney tumor in children. If it's detected, it's totally curable. But mostly here in the continent, the lack of identification, this kind of cases are missing. And there's a big consortium, not just involved the African continent, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa, but we also are working with Brazil, which has one of the most diverse populations there in terms of race. Then I will stop here and just I can go to the specifics of each of the research, but I will leave this more as a general overview of our of the ICGB efforts trying to cover the genomics and help the clinical trials and the diversity in these clinical trials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zabini. Any interest of avoiding the calamities of the previous session, I'm going to request Yusuf to step up, and then we will allow for questions. I know there's a lot of questions, and hopefully Louise will still be around. Yusuf, we're now crossing over to the US of A. This is like an international panel. We're jumping all over the continent and then jumping the seas and everything. Is Yusuf there? Or is the technical team of unit still struggling? Yusuf, over to you.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please introduce yourself and then you can take the mic.
Yes, Yusuf Enriquez, founder and CEO of Indigenous AI. I'm still not able to share, so we'll see if that pops up here.
Hi. I did. Okay.
You guys see my screen?
I did was short, was 5 minutes maximum, and at least I present, and Lawrence cannot say anything. Okay.
You guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but Luis refuses to go away. So, 1 minute, you can you can go, Yusuf.
Okay. Yeah, I won't hold up. I know there are a lot of people that want to ask questions. I think the theme, as you could hear, is what we're showing here on the screen, the problem. And I'm not gonna, Yao has done a good job, and Luis have kind of touched on some of the things. But this hopefully numbers help you jog your memory, as you can see. So my prior background worked at the Food and Drug Administration for the U.S. Deep regulatory affairs background, and have actually, set up a lot of the FDA locations outside of the U.S. For regulatory approval. So, it comes down to what you see here. The Africa diaspora is very underrepresented, as the previous presenters have stated, and that's across the board: genomic data, clinical trial participation, and biorepository. And so, when you have this kind of deficiency, as Yao and others have mentioned, you cannot have diversity within the genomic and clinical trial, drug trials. And so that's a huge problem. So, currently 80 to 85% of the drug trials are European white males. And you can see how that affects not just, minorities itself, but women as well, where, we don't really truly know the efficacy on the genomic side. As Yao has mentioned, we don't see the complete genome that has been boasted over the last couple of months as really being complete because of these lack of representation. One of the other deficient areas that I want to normally touch on is the biobanks. This is like the foundation of where, again, I think, on the Africa continent, I've been stressing and deeply emphasizing on countries to put emphasis on making sure that these are established, because these are where genomic materials reside, from the informed consent, collecting the samples, being able to establish protocols in order to then further move into phenomes from their genome, transcriptome, proteome, and metabolome to be studied and used in research and clinical trials. And this library of specimen could then be used, with academic researchers on the continent to be able to start doing some of the actual research on the continent. I think one of the major things that I've stressed and want to highlight is the fact that infrastructure is a big component of moving Africa into precision medicine and being a leader, which I believe Africa is set up to do with infrastructure and, of course, money, which is always the two things that eludes advancement in precision medicine and just research overall because of the lack of some of those things. And so, one of the areas, again, the underdevelopment of this area is still problematic. Consistency across the continent is still not there yet around biorepository, standards, customization of training is going to be essential to even move into genomic research because of the complexity and the intricate training that's required in order to do, whole genome sequencing in order to have to focus on the disease areas that that the other presenters have mentioned. And so, I like to start at the baseline of making sure that Africa is moving in the right direction of making sure that, we're even able to do this from a, translational research standpoint, but also being able to house the data both on the front end and the back end. So biobanking is, a critical component on the front end in order to move Africa into genomic sequencing and academic research. And then the other area on the back end is infrastructure around technology. So, I have a slide here that really kind of points to some of the things that was mentioned by the first presenter around, just being able to do this type of research because of the large intensive data repository that's going to be needed. Your whole genome sequencing is going to need a lot of storage. And so, we're going to need to make sure that we have the capacity to do some of these things here. And as you've seen, when we looked across the map, this is an example that I pulled from stack development, which is technology, architecture, and infrastructure, which was the reason for indigenous to settle in South Africa instead of other parts of the continent. Because when we looked across where we were able to do Azure machine learning, this is from Microsoft, and you see Microsoft Genomics there, we're still lacking in technology infrastructure to even move forward with doing some of the research. Now, why is that important? As you saw from the first presenter, a lot of the publication that are being done, even though the participants are from Africa, most of the downstream data repository, analytics, and then, of course, the authors for some of these papers are from European and Western countries because that infrastructure is not there in Africa. We're getting there. Some bioinformatics is there, but the level of compute power that's required to do this type of sequencing and data aggregation is currently not there. And that's one of the goals of Indigenous, is to actually build these infrastructure where we are currently. I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. We're building our lab in Cape Town, where we're going to be able to do some of the, the machine learning, the genomics, and the analytics, so that we don't have to, if we're not shipping the samples out, I don't see the need to ship the data out as well, because we don't have that compute power. So I just wanted to highlight these are some areas, that are quintessential and critical for us to move into, really going into precision medicine and being able to have sound academic research and publication that has inclusion of the African diaspora. So some of the things that, again, Indigenous is doing there in Cape Town. I just came back a few months ago. We've been able to partner with Orem Institute, which is one of the leading institutions there in HIV, AIDS, and TB. Because of my FDA background, I've had intricate knowledge of the work that Orem does, the credibility and the way they go about doing their informed consent is in high standards. And so we've partnered with them. We've launched about 2 weeks now. When they came here to visit us to look at our lab here in Washington, D.C. We've launched the 500 Africa Genome Project to start doing genome sequencing, and our lab there in Cape Town at the Chick Building will be the location where the samples get collected, sequenced, and the analytics will be done there. Another partnership we've established is in Kavi, Kenya AIDS Vaccine Institute in Kenya, around HIV. That's in Nairobi, next to the University of Nairobi campus. And we're looking to replicate the same type of infrastructure. So, our goal is to at least set up a small mini lab in some of the countries that have had some development, which, Kenya has started to move within that technology advancement. And we're working with Microsoft to make sure that we have that analytical capability there. And here in DC, we're doing a large African-American genomes around endometriosis, fibroids, polycystic ovary syndrome at our JLabs DC lab. Technology and security is going to be a key thing. We acquired a company called Encryption, where blockchain, which is pretty permanent on the continent around fintech. We're working with some of the individuals around, building up this technology area within the life science area. So taking something that's already had some traction on the continent and moving it into, privacy and security and protecting genomic data and the data sovereignty of the samples collective from individual on the continent is important to me and important to our business model. And so we've incorporated blockchain in how we go about collecting samples. And so we feel confident that, these are some of the technology and innovation that will be able to drive genomic research on the continent. And building capacity is where I like to focus, because again, we need the foundation in order to help our young bright scientists on the continent to be able to do these type of research. And so I've been intricately involved with some of the relationships with building public-private partnerships with government and some of the high federal labs that are responsible for some of the sample collection currently in Rwanda, Kavi, as I mentioned, the RBC, Rwanda Biomedical, and RE, and working on a couple of other countries, Tanzania and Ghana. And so, innovative solution, if you wanted to kind of, understand how this, looks from a discovery, drug discovery, moving into manufacturing, which was brought up before, which is what we're going to need to do once we have the data and we have the analytics. And so Indigenous has created a blockchain encrypted repository to house that data and being able to do and detect novel signature sequence, biomarkers, polygenic risk score. But none of this is possible without the things we mentioned earlier on the slides. And so, you can look at this as phases, and hopefully, as we start to move into the age of precision medicine and getting the continent up on technology infrastructure and building the infrastructure and training our young scientists on the continent to stay on the continent to do some of this work, we'll start to see this ecosystem grow. And these are some of the key strategic partnerships. We've partnered with Aurum, and we're currently in deep conversations with one of the oldest and largest pharmaceutical company in Ghana, with Pfizer, where we're talking about the future of drug discovery and what drug manufacturing looks like on the continent. So I'll stop there. Always a pleasure to present with Yao, and thanks for the invitation, Dr. Masomi. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to hear from you, Yusuf, as well. I'm going to flip the coin. Usually I ask the questions, and I have a big book that I prepare before each webinar. I'm going to ask the audience to ask the question, but request that when a person goes to the mic over there, they don't give a speech. Just ask the question, or maybe make a short comment. So I'm opening it up for questions. If no one stands up, I'm going to start calling some of my friends and bully them. I see there's one question. Please say your name and your organization and then that's
Thank you. Janine Schofield from the CSIR. So one of the comments that I noted with this, and I was wondering if we're reinforcing it enough, is it's not just that the genetic research that's been done is missing a population. It's actually that a lot of the genetic research, if it was done on these populations, would be advantageous for the rest of the world. So it just makes sense for this to happen. With that, I just wanted to expound for the incredible talks that were made today. I'm very lucky to be an editor-in-chief of the Springer Nature Journal Gene Therapy, and I'd like to encourage you to submit perspectives or papers on topics like this. There'll be a friendly person waiting on the other side. Please look for my name. And this is exactly the kind of topic that we want to see more on the journal. So I'm sorry, it was more of a comment than a question, but please.
It was a speech. Thank you so much, Janine. Any other question? I want to ask Giorgio. I'm picking on you because you're my friend. Is it too far? And any other people who are going to, just to make it easy, before I pick on people. I don't like being called a bully, even though I am.
Thank you, Zomi, to picking me up, but I took a little bit of notes during all this. First of all, I'm very impressed with all the presentation, really very good. And I'm not going to give a speech. I will try to come with some questions and really comments that will become questions. And my general question about this precision medicine, oncology in Africa is really very much related to impact on patients. And my first point is, I lived in many African countries, and apart from some of them, like South Africa, the majority of oncology drugs that are available, the access to these drugs is very limited. They are very expensive, they are patent protected, and it's really a very big issue, first of all, to have those drugs that eventually would not be working in some of the population in Africa. So, and I do understand that, but I think that this is a very important point to be underlined when we talk about that. The other thing is about regulatory issue. This is, if we understand that research is being conducted, and we understand that through precision medicine that some population do not respond to that specific drug or have response that are not what is expected from that, that should be part of what the African Medicine Authority agency should be dealing with. And then that should be a very important regulatory issue. So all what is currently done in terms of clinical research should be connected, and that's what I didn't hear is, the access to drugs, and the other thing is about regulatory issue and how do we know about all these things happening and these drugs are being sold and we know that patients are not probably responding properly. What is our reaction to that? And last one is about biobanks and all what's happening. I know that African CDC, for example, is putting up a huge network of biobanks, and I was very reassured by the last presentation by Dr. Yusuf, I think, where he's saying that he's working already and trying to capitalize on piggybacking on what's going on already on TB and HIV and seeing what that capacity could be then translated also in medicine. And what I'm saying is that, for example, the African CDC is putting up an incredible genomic capacity all over Africa around COVID-19. And is that not part of what could be a contributor to what you are trying to do? So I think I finished all my thing. And most of this must be irrelevant, but thank you, Tommy, to give me the chance.
Thank you. We'll take all the questions first. I think there was another hand at the back. If they can come to the front and ask the question, if they have not gotten COVID, and then we'll close the questions.
All right, thank you so much. Professor Ransaram from University of KwaZulu-Natal. I think, basically covered some of my questions as well. I think, a lot of what has been discussed at the workshop so far is, mainly along the private kind of capacities. How do we get government involved in this as well? Rizwana touched on some of that from SAMRC side, but I feel this is happening in a lot of private capacity type of scenario. So, what Yusuf presented was really great. And I think there is some centers that do exist within South Africa that he can partner with as well to achieve this goal of, 500,000 sequences. And I think, merging or working with existing facilities is what we need. And, getting government involved in this, because what is going to happen eventually is that these private entities will have access to all of this data, and government is left behind, again, trying to, bridge the gaps. So if we can try and get government to start funding a lot of this, or even being part of a lot of the conversations, I think that's where we need to start going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kanyezi Masondo from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So I don't remember which was the doctor, but he was from the Yamak Biotechnology, and he mentioned that the precision medicine are less accurate in blacks. So, and he also mentioned that there have been tools that have been used, but they have seemed to be less effective. So I wanted to ask, which are those tools that have been used and why they have not been effectively, specifically in blacks? Thank you.
Thank you. So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond in 2 to 3 minutes. We've got less than 20 minutes. It's not my fault. I'm not being a bully. It's the previous session, starting with Rizwana. You can just respond, summarizing your sense of the questions, because they have a single recurrent theme.
Yes. So I think, this is why we set up the European African Personalized Medicine Consortium, and we're lucky to have the European Commission fund it and see the worth in doing that. And Professor Varan Ramsaran mentioned that there's a need for advocacy at the government level, and that's what we anticipate, that by getting this sort of context in order, by having robust stakeholder engagement at the ground level, there'll be more of a context that can be addressed. And this goes back to even when we started, and Dr. Nsomi also mentioned the fact that the research agenda and the funding agenda is dictated by the global north, and it would be, because we're not self-funding. We found that when we compared the research outputs in South Africa compared to Egypt, although they're comparable, South Africa has a lot of self-funding in its ecosystem, and where the research agenda is more or less directed through government. And so we find that the outputs are more relevant for our context, whereas Egypt, although they have a very high number of research publications, their outputs were largely leaning on collaboration with Europe. And so I think it's a discussion that needs to happen on all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Rizwana. I think that resonates a lot with the declaration that happened this morning, something that needs to be pursued, probably in a future webinar. I would like to invite Yao to respond to some of the questions.
I think, all the questions were very interesting, and I mean, I can touch on a couple of them. In terms of drug accessibility, I think that it's a very good point. Many precision medicines are not available or are not affordable for people in Africa. But sometimes the drug companies use the excuse that we don't have the companion diagnostic capacity to identify people. So many of these precision medicines require molecular diagnostic tests to identify patients who would benefit the most. Now, unfortunately, we don't have as much molecular diagnostic capacity across Africa. I mean, before COVID, you could hardly get PCR in many places. Now everybody's talking about PCR, but unfortunately, the way it has been deployed, it's mostly COVID PCR. So what we need to do is see a transition using these technologies that have been provided for COVID to now apply them to other diseases. But I believe that if we can begin to develop molecular diagnostic capacity, for instance, for cancer, if we can provide some of these oncology companion diagnostic services, then we can put pressure on pharma to make these drugs available. Pharma is not going to make the drug available unless they know that there are adequate diagnostic capacities to identify patients so that the drugs can be used properly. If you use precision medicine, if you use precision tools in a non-precise or an imprecise way, the tools don't work, and that makes the drug look bad, and pharma doesn't want that. So I think one way is to try to develop capacity locally to provide a companion diagnostics, then turn around and put pressure on pharma to provide these tools, these drugs at affordable prices. We are seeing a little bit of it happening. For instance, Herceptin is available for free in Ghana now. Roche is providing it. So there are ways that you can get pharma to provide drugs, but usually the barrier is access to adequate diagnostics to identify patients. So I think we can begin to address it from that angle and then apply pressure on pharma and also on governments to find ways to subsidize these treatments. I think the idea of private versus government, I fully understand. Yusuf and I both have started private companies. But I think you have to recognize that South Africa is not Africa. Outside of South Africa, you really have very little government support for healthcare. So South Africa, even though I know my South African colleagues always complain that it doesn't look as good from South Africa as it looks from the outside, I keep reminding them that even if it's not ideal, it's way better. You actually have an MRC. In Ghana, we don't have an MRC. Nigeria does not have an MRC. Many countries in Africa do not have any public funding for research. Ghana has a bill that has sat in parliament for 5 years to create a national research fund, and we still don't have one. So people like me who are starting private initiatives, what we are trying to do is we recognize that if we wait for government, we'll never get anything done. Of course, we look to find ways to partner with government as and when there are opportunities. So I think in countries like South Africa, where there is at least some public support for research and there is some funding, it makes plenty of sense to find ways to engage very early. In other countries where there is no public support, no government funding for research, private initiatives may need to take the lead. But I agree entirely that we need to look for ways as early as possible to engage with the public sector to try to make sure that access is guaranteed. But it's just one of those things where in many African countries, you just don't have a strong enough public sector engagement with healthcare. And so if you sit around waiting for governments to do anything, you sit in meetings for 5 years and achieve nothing. So I think it's sort of a pragmatic approach that some of us are having to take. And it will differ for different countries. And so the approach will have to be tailored depending on the environment. I think there was a question about what tools. Finally, there was a question perhaps directed directly to me about which tools don't work as well. There are certain, 23andMe, for instance, is a company that makes diagnostic tools that are, they use polygenic risk scores, which Yusuf mentioned, to try to determine your risk for developing a particular disease. Now, these polygenic risk scores are notoriously inaccurate in ethnicities that are not Caucasian. So that's just one example where we need polygenic risk scores that are developed based on more diverse data. Currently, many of these are not very well developed. And so we find issues with that. And there's growing evidence that diseases like cancers manifest differently depending on your ethnicity. Breast cancer appears to be much more aggressive in Black women and presents at a much younger age. So these undoubtedly have at least some genetic component. There may be environmental factors as well. But I think all of that points to the fact that we need a much more diverse data set, a much more diverse body of research to be able to make that, to be able to better address these issues. And I'd just like to reemphasize the point that the lady from the Gene Therapy Journal said is, we are advocating research in Africa, not just for Africa, but for the world. If the world is going to get on top of genetic diseases, it has to pay attention to Africa because Africa holds the key. And I think that's something that has to be understood and will hopefully unlock a lot more resources to do this kind of work in Africa, for Africa, but also for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Yao. And I guess I see George gesticulating, agreeing with you, Yao. And I guess in the interest of mobilizing the vote for my re-election as president of Africa Bio, I want to assure you, Yao, that this convention that you missed has seen a number of startups from across the continent. And you've actually pointed the key to how we tackle this problem, because even as we have the view that South Africa has a lot of funding for the public research system, it is absolutely there's a lot of disequilibrium, and there is a need for startups like yours to step onto the plate and fill the gap. And I think I've been encouraged by what I've seen in this convention. And you are a beacon of hope. With that, I'd like to ask Yusuf to step on and maybe dispute the fact that he, as an American, is blessed. Yusuf.
I know, appreciate it. No, look, I echo everything y'all said. The future of precision medicine is in the Africa diaspora, and so that's why I had to look at this globally when I did the MIT hackathon 2 years ago, and looking at how to address these things. Unfortunately, the diversity trials spread across the globe. So even here in the U.S., with all the funding that we have, there is that lack of diversity, even the African American diaspora, where we're still struggling with looking at different disease areas that affect health disparities in Africa and here in African Americans. So I think the problem has been, globalized over the pandemic. And so, to touch on the Africa CDC work and effort, which has been tremendous with some of that public-private partnerships that I mentioned to you. But, again, it seems a little bit more siloed in just one track where, most of that work, if you hear about what's going on, it's pathogen genome sequencing. It's not whole genome sequencing that would benefit companies like mine and Yao, because it's really focused on, diagnostic around the COVID, as he mentioned. We need to spend some more energy with making sure that we're looking at also the disease prevalence and trying to use some of these molecular diagnostic technology, which is what Indigenous does. The next gen sequencing platform that is required to start looking at the human genome has now been advanced to where it is able to map the entire human genome. Unfortunately, small studies that have been done on Africa diaspora have identified what Yao mentioned, that about 10% of the genome that were identified in African diaspora genome sequence are represented in no libraries across the globe. That's a big problem. You have about 3 billion genes in your body, so that's about 300 million genes that are not being represented in any libraries across the globe, and we're expecting to use these particular libraries to drive drug discovery and drug development. So, I do agree that Africa CDC has been very engaged due to the pandemic. I think what we would love to see now is us moving into more of, disease management and looking at how some of these molecular diagnostic tests that are accurate, but that's also a problem because of what Yao just mentioned, because a lot of these have only been tested within, Caucasian population, white population, which is where the health disparity and, some of the deficiencies in some of these tests like the ones he mentioned. And so, I think it's going to take that public-private partnership, that's going to be really needed to drive this further and make a lot of these things, prevalent country and on the continent by country. Because as Yao mentioned, some privileges that, South Africa has and being in Ghana, I was surprised to see that, they didn't have some of those other standards and research dollars that could be allocated in order to enhance the stuff that they're doing around sickle cell. A lot of the initiatives are being done, through organization like Clinton Health Access and Innovation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates, which Orem Institute partners with in order to get funding for some of these in South Africa. So, I'm all for, like you said, governments getting involved, which was one of the questions that was brought up and comments. But it's been seen to me as being an individual that's not on the continent, that's a slow walk with trying to get government to get behind some of these things. We were hoping that the pandemic was able to drive a little bit more energy behind it, but unfortunately we haven't seen that be a added value around, looking at some of the disease areas that are not prevalent around COVID. So, I think one of the major things, the takeaways for, the individuals in the room there is that there is startup companies that's willing to focus on these areas, but it's going to need support infrastructure in order to do this. And I think, what Yao mentioned is right on point, where we're going to need to drive and build our own repository, build our own library, so that we could move into a more deeper knowledge around precision medicine and how we can use technology to kind of drive what we need to do on the continent. So I'll pause there, but I think overall, the movement to what we're trying to achieve is there. Just need some support from government entities across the continent.
Thank you. Thank you to my esteemed panelists. This is a very difficult session. It always is. We could go on for days, but unfortunately, I know that I'm standing between you, the audience, and some lubricants, which are being freely offered downstairs. I'd like to take the opportunity to invite everybody to the next webinar. We host webinars every 2 months on average, discussing diversity in clinical trials. Be on the lookout for invitations. They are as exciting as this one today, and they are discussing a very important issue. And I think this convention has been about that in a lot of ways. And we would like to invite all of you to be on the lookout for it. I hope I did not embarrass myself today. Usually, Judy has signals for me to tell me to shut up. I'll share them with you when we're having the cocktail. But thank you to Yao, thank you to Yusuf for being troopers and for staying the course, and thank you to Rizwana for joining the family of outlaws. Thank you so much. Give yourself a warm hug. Yeah. Thank you.